I was making my morning coffee just like every other quiet Tuesday when my phone rang. The name flashing across the screen, Clarissa Holton, sent a familiar tightness through my chest. Not because I missed her or wished to hear from her, but because every call from that woman meant she was about to take something else that was never hers to begin with. "I sold the house," she announced flatly, skipping any greeting, her voice laced with smug satisfaction. "The papers are signed. The new owners move in next week. I hope this teaches you to respect your elders." For a moment, I said nothing. Not out of shock or confusion, but because that arrogant tone made me realize something chilling. Clarissa truly believed the house my father left me now belonged to her. She thought she'd won, that I would quietly pack my things and walk away from the place woven into the deepest corners of my memory. But what Clarissa didn't know was that I had been preparing for this exact moment, the moment she'd pull the trigger, never realizing it was aimed at herself. I set my coffee cup down gently, the spoon tapping the rim like a countdown to a battle that had been quietly brewing for years. And in that battle, I was never unarmed. Clarissa Holton wasn't always the manipulative woman I came to know. When she first entered my father's life, I admit, I wanted to believe she was exactly what he needed: a warm companion after years of grief following my mother's passing. She was charming in public, soft-spoken in front of him, and always found just the right words to earn polite approval at family dinners. But beneath her practiced smile and carefully chosen compliments, there was a calculation in her eyes, something I had noticed early on, but pushed aside, believing it was just me being overly protective of my father. After they married, it didn't take long for that mask to slip. She began making quiet suggestions to redecorate the house, replacing vintage with modern, claiming the old oak panels and stained glass windows were outdated and too dark. At first, my father gently declined, clearly attached to the home he had poured decades of love into, but as his health began to wane, Clarissa became bolder. I still remember the day I came over to find the original hand-carved banisters dismantled and sitting out by the curb like garbage. She smiled, unapologetic, and said she was bringing the house into the 21st century, as if history and memory were just clutter she could sweep aside. I tried to reason with her, explaining how each beam and window held pieces of my father's story, the years he spent restoring them by hand, the weekends we worked side by side, covered in dust but proud of the progress we made. But Clarissa would brush it off, claiming I was being sentimental and resistant to change, often adding passive-aggressive jabs about how I was just the daughter and that decisions now belong to adults in the house. Even then, I bit my tongue, more for my father's sake than hers. He was fragile and I didn't want to burden him with conflict, but I saw the way he looked at me when Clarissa left the room, tired, regretful, as if he understood what was happening but felt powerless to stop it. I didn't know until much later that he had already begun putting safeguards in place to protect what mattered. When he passed, the grief was compounded by a sense of isolation I hadn't anticipated. Clarissa wasted no time asserting her dominance. She hosted a small gathering the day after the funeral, walking guests through the house like a real estate agent, pointing out what she planned to change now that it's finally mine to do with as I please. I stood there, listening in stunned silence, realizing she had waited for this moment with far more anticipation than sorrow. Within the week, she had cleared out his study, his books, his journals, his old watch, all gone or boxed up without a word to me. When I protested, she dismissed me, claiming it was time to let go of the past, and that she was now in charge of the estate. But what she didn't know, what she could never have imagined, was that my father, even in his declining days, had never truly trusted her. Weeks before he died, he called me into his study on a quiet evening when Clarissa was out. His voice was faint, but his words were deliberate. "There's more going on here than you see, Liv," he said, using the nickname only he ever called me. "When I'm gone, talk to James Langford, my attorney. He'll explain everything. I've made arrangements to protect what matters." I didn't understand fully at the time, but I nodded, memorizing every detail of that conversation because something in his eyes told me this was no ordinary warning. It was a final act of love. True to his word, James Langford confirmed everything. My father had taken steps, complex legal ones, to ensure that the house, the one that had stood in our family for 3 generations, would never legally fall into Clarissa's hands. Despite the title appearing to be under my father's name, a trust had been quietly established years ago with me as the sole beneficiary, hidden under layers of legal insulation that no outsider could touch. I didn't tell her, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted the truth to play out exactly as it needed to. So when she called me that morning, announcing she'd sold the house and expected me to vacate by the end of the week, I let her speak, allowed her arrogance to unfold unchallenged. She believed she was finally pushing me out for good. She had no idea she'd just signed her own undoing. As I listened to her gloat, rattling off imaginary buyers and fabricated signatures, I imagined the expression on her face when the real paperwork surfaced. The trust documents, the original transfer of ownership, the legal wall my father had built around the house and me. And in that moment, I didn't feel rage. I felt something far stronger. Clarity. She had betrayed my father, disrespected his memory, and tried to erase his legacy for the sake of control and image. But her greatest mistake wasn't underestimating him. It was underestimating me. After hanging up the phone, I sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of Clarissa's words settle over me like dust on an untouched windowsill. The house, my father's house, was more than just timber and tile. It was a living memory, a vessel that held the laughter of birthdays, the quiet creak of stairs under late-night footsteps, and the warmth of a man who believed in preserving what mattered. Clarissa saw walls and profit margins. I saw Sunday mornings in the garden, the faint scent of his aftershave lingering in the study, and the worn spot on the banister where his hand had always rested. I rose slowly and walked through the halls, trailing my fingers along the crown moulding he had carved by hand, each groove telling its own story. The scent of old wood and linseed oil lingered faintly, mingled with memories I had kept buried since the day we laid him to rest. In the living room, the fireplace he restored, stone by stone, year after year, stood cold now, as if mourning with me. I could still hear his voice echoing in that space, explaining how each piece fit, how patience and care turned ruins into refuge. Clarissa had never understood that. She once suggested replacing the fireplace entirely, calling it outdated and depressing, oblivious to the fact that it was the heart of the house, and perhaps the heart of the man she had claimed to love. Her efforts to renovate had never been about improvement. They were erasure, an attempt to scrub out everything that didn't fit her version of luxury or control. The mosaic window at the stairwell, which my father had restored over 2 summers, was nearly shattered when she wanted to replace it with modern glass for better light. Only my intervention had stopped her then, but now I wondered what she would destroy if I hadn't been there to stop her again. 5 years earlier, when I was 23 and still trying to understand adulthood, Clarissa came into our lives. At first, she wore kindness like a shawl, always offering help, always listening with what seemed like genuine warmth. She baked pies on weekends, sat beside him at community events, and even complimented the very features of the house she would later try to tear apart. But those early moments, as I came to understand, were part of a strategy. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to wedge herself between us. She would make light-hearted jokes about how I still acted like Daddy's little girl, or raise her eyebrows at how often he and I talked late into the night. It wasn't overt at first, but there was a sharpness behind her smile, one I had felt before I could name it. As my father's health began to decline, starting with fatigue, then dizziness, and later long stretches of quiet staring, I watched helplessly as Clarissa grew bolder. She assumed authority over his meals, managed his appointments, and subtly began redirecting conversations that didn't involve her. I didn't want to believe she was doing anything wrong, not at first. I told myself that grief made me suspicious, that I was simply afraid of losing the man who had raised me alone. But the truth had a way of whispering louder than denial. One evening, a few months before his passing, he called me into his study while Clarissa was away at one of her spa retreats. The room was dim, the air heavy with quiet urgency. He looked tired, more tired than I had ever seen him. But when he said my name, it was with clarity and calm. "Liv," he said, using that childhood nickname only he ever called me. "I need you to trust me. Things aren't what they seem with her. And when the time comes, you'll know what to do. Talk to James Langford. He has everything in place." I remember the chill that crawled up my spine at his words, but I didn't press him. He looked so frail, and I feared that asking more would drain what little strength he had left. So I nodded, and we sat there for a while. No more questions, just silence between a father and daughter who knew they were nearing the edge of something final. 2 weeks later, he was gone. Clarissa wasted no time stepping into what she believed was her role as lady of the house. She had his belongings moved into storage, often without even informing me, and she redecorated entire rooms under the pretense of starting fresh. She never consulted me, never paused to consider what he might have wanted, and certainly never acknowledged what I might be feeling. Her vision of grief was glossy and performative. Well-placed flowers, a perfectly pressed black dress, and carefully curated sorrow at public gatherings. But behind closed doors she was calculating, reorganizing, and asserting dominance. What she didn't realize, what she never could have imagined, was that my father, despite his failing health, had seen her for exactly who she was. And though he didn't confront her in life, he took quiet, deliberate steps to protect the home and the legacy he knew she would try to claim. My meeting with James Langford, just days after the funeral, revealed a plan far more intricate than I had expected. Through a series of trusts and ownership transfers masked under legal complexities, my father had shielded the house from Clarissa entirely. On paper, it had never truly belonged to him in his final years. It had always been mine. The realization hit me like a wave, not just the legal victory, but the emotional one. My father hadn't been blind. He hadn't chosen her over me. He had seen everything, understood it all, and while he may not have spoken it aloud, he had acted with a clarity that surpassed any spoken reassurance. That knowledge didn't erase the grief, but it softened its edges. It gave me a sense of quiet vindication, a reminder that I hadn't imagined the shifting air in our home or the coldness that crept in under Clarissa's carefully rehearsed warmth. That house, our house, was more than brick and wood. It was my father's final love letter, written not in words but in foresight. And now, as Clarissa prepared to throw me out of it, believing she had finally won, I stood silently with a truth she hadn't yet seen coming. After that call with Clarissa, when she so triumphantly declared the house sold and my eviction inevitable, I didn't respond with anger or threats. I didn't raise my voice or argue because, truthfully, I didn't need to. I had already played my part in this game months, no, years, before she realized it had even begun. As the morning sun filtered through the kitchen windows, casting a soft glow over the oak floor my father and I had refinished together one summer long ago, I reached for my phone and dialed James Langford's direct line. He answered on the second ring, his tone warm and steady, as if he'd been expecting this moment all along. "She did it," I said plainly. "She actually tried to sell the house." There was a pause, not of surprise, but of quiet confirmation, before his voice came through with the same composed authority I had grown to rely on. "Then I think it's time we put things in motion." "Yes," I replied, my fingers resting on the edge of the kitchen counter, tracing the familiar notches left from years of use. "And please make sure the buyers understand the situation clearly. I don't want innocent people caught in this mess." "I'll take care of it," he said. "The documents are all prepared. Her lawyer is about to get quite a surprise." When the call ended, I didn't feel relief. Not yet. But I did feel a shift, as if the balance of power that had long tilted in her favour had begun to realign. I moved through the house slowly, letting my hand glide across surfaces that held stories only I seemed to remember. Stories Clarissa had tried to erase, painting over history in her sterile shades of grey and silver. The dining room still bore faint marks where my father had once measured and cut wood late into the night. The study, though rearranged, still held the energy of long conversations about life, dreams, and disappointments, and in the garden, the roses he had nurtured from bare roots were beginning to bloom again, just as they had every spring since I was a child. Clarissa had threatened to dig them up last year, claiming they were too traditional, but I had stood my ground then, just as I was about to stand it again now. It wasn't just about the house. It never had been. It was about the life embedded within it. The slow mornings, the laughter that echoed down the halls, the quiet companionship between a father and daughter who had weathered storms far deeper than this. It was about dignity and preservation, about honouring what could not be rebuilt once destroyed. Clarissa, in her arrogance, had moved forward as if paperwork and charm were all she needed to rewrite the past. But she had never understood my father, nor had she grasped the kind of man he was when no one was watching. He had been deliberate, measured, always 5 steps ahead of any storm he saw coming. That's why, before he died, he had made sure James Langford held more than just documents. He held a map to every safeguard, every layer of protection, every clause and transfer that would ensure Clarissa's plan would crumble the moment she tried to act on it. And crumble it would. Later that day, James messaged me with a brief update. The buyers have been informed. They're understandably upset, but grateful they learned the truth before signing over any funds. Their lawyer is drafting a formal response as we speak. How long before she finds out? I asked. I'd say by this afternoon, he replied. Would you like me to be present when she receives it? I considered it, briefly picturing the look on her face as the truth unfolded. How her self-assurance would falter, how the facade she had so carefully curated would begin to crack. No, I said after a moment. Let her open it alone. She needs to understand this for herself. Understood, he replied. Just be prepared. People like her don't take humiliation lightly. He wasn't wrong. Clarissa had always needed control the way some people need oxygen. Without it, she unravelled quickly. She had spent years perfecting her image, using charm and subtle manipulation to craft a version of herself that no one questioned. But now the real story would begin to unfold, and it would be one she couldn't narrate. Around 3 in the afternoon, the notifications started coming in. Missed calls, a string of frantic messages, and finally, a single text written in all caps that read, "What have you done?" I didn't answer. I was in the garden, kneeling beside the rose bushes my father had so lovingly tended, my hands buried in the soil that still smelled of spring, the scent of blooming petals mixed with fresh earth, and I felt calm, grounded, unmoved by her chaos. I knew she would come. She had always preferred confrontation to contemplation, and it wasn't long before I heard the screech of her car tires outside. I stood, brushing the dirt from my jeans, just as she stormed down the stone path, clutching a thick envelope in one hand and rage in the other. Her heels sank into the soft lawn as she marched toward me, waving what I could only assume was the letter from the buyer's attorney. "You conniving little—" she began, her voice already fraying at the edges, but I raised a hand, calmly and quietly. "I'd be careful with your next words, Clarissa," I said. "You're standing in front of a woman who has nothing left to lose, and everything already secured." Her eyes widened, and for the first time in a long time, I saw something flicker behind them that looked like doubt, perhaps even fear. But I didn't gloat. I didn't shout. I simply stood there, among the roses my father planted, as the house behind me stood firm, rooted not just in soil, but in truth, memory, and legacy. She came exactly as I knew she would. Angrily, unannounced, and louder than necessary, her expensive car screeching into the gravel driveway like it had something to prove. Clarissa Holton was never one to take humiliation lightly, and the thick envelope in her hand flapped in rhythm with her furious stride as she stormed down the path toward me. I was already outside tending to the rose garden my father had planted decades earlier, the same one she had once tried to uproot because no one grows heirloom roses anymore. I stood slowly, dusting soil from my hands, and watched as she crossed the lawn with the calculated fury of someone whose entire illusion was collapsing. "You conniving little liar," she hissed, waving the letter in my face, her carefully painted mask cracking under the weight of shock. "You knew about this the whole time, about the trust, the transfer, the lawyer, all of it. You and James planned this behind my back." I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I looked her square in the eyes, calm and steady, and answered with the truth that had waited too long to be spoken. "No, Clarissa. My father planned it. Mr. Langford simply carried out his wishes. I just followed instructions." Her expression twisted, contorted by disbelief and wounded pride. And for a moment, she looked less like the composed woman she presented to the world, and more like a desperate figure clinging to a narrative she could no longer control. "Your father would never do this to me," she said, but the words rang hollow, as though she was trying to convince herself more than me. I tilted my head, voice quiet but firm. "Are you sure about that? Or did he just let you believe he would?" Clarissa took a step back, the heels of her designer shoes sinking slightly into the soft lawn, her breath catching as the weight of my words settled between us like morning fog. She had always been so certain she had fooled him, had charmed her way into complete control. But what she failed to grasp was that my father wasn't the kind of man who confronted problems head-on. He observed, waited, and prepared. I stepped closer slowly, deliberately, my tone steady. The house was never in his name when he died. He placed it in a trust years ago, before he ever met you. I'm the sole beneficiary, Clarissa. You never had a right to sell it, and you certainly don't have the right to kick me out. She shook her head, a trembling hand running through her hair, the crisp papers crumpling in her grip. "Number, that can't be. That's not." But even she couldn't finish the sentence, because somewhere deep down, she knew. She had always known that my father didn't fully trust her, that behind his quiet demeanour was a man capable of subtle, brilliant defiance. "Check the county records," I offered gently. "They're public. You'll find everything there, the dates, the signatures, the filings. He made sure of it. Transparency was important to him." Clarissa's eyes began to dart, the way someone's do when their mind races ahead of their words, scrambling for an escape hatch in a room that's slowly locking shut. "The buyers are threatening legal action," she snapped. "Do you have any idea how this makes me look?" I felt the corner of my mouth lift, not in triumph but in acknowledgement. "Almost as humiliating as trying to throw your stepdaughter out of her own home," I replied. "Or maybe as humiliating as pretending to care about someone just long enough to secure your place in their will." She looked like she had been slapped, her breath catching again, but this time there was no fury, only the dawning realization that the version of events she had built around herself was now irreversibly crumbling. "You don't understand anything about what your father and I had," she whispered, her voice hoarse and shrinking. "I understand more than you think," I said, stepping past her toward the porch. "He told me about the prenup you refused to sign, the bank withdrawals, the men you met with while he was sick. He knew everything, Clarissa. He just chose to watch and wait." There it was. That final flicker of power in her eyes dimming. She looked away, blinking rapidly, as if by not meeting my gaze she could somehow will the truth into silence. Her shoulders sagged beneath the weight of exposure, her hands now trembling not with rage but with something closer to defeat. "I recorded this conversation, by the way," I added, my voice still calm but resolute. Would you like me to add it to the file Mr. Langford is compiling regarding your attempt to fraudulently sell property you never owned?" She froze and for a long moment said nothing. That silence was perhaps louder than all her earlier shouting. She looked down at the letter she had come to wave in my face, her so-called proof of power, and slowly lowered it to her side, her fingers unclenching just enough for the pages to loosen and bend. "You wouldn't dare," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. I met her eyes with quiet strength, the kind my father had always believed in, and replied softly, "My father's memory can withstand the truth, Clarissa. Can yours?" That was the breaking point. She stepped back again, nearly stumbling over the uneven garden stones. Her carefully manicured exterior, so polished for years, had cracked, and now all that remained was a woman who had bet everything on manipulation and lost to patience, love, and foresight. "Fine," she spat, her voice brittle. "Keep the house. Keep your little victory. But don't think this means you've won." "I already have," I said without raising my voice. "I won the moment my father saw you for who you really were." She turned then, stumbling slightly on her heels, her gait no longer confident but disjointed, almost frantic. As she reached her car, she dropped the crumpled letter into the garden and didn't look back. I waited until the sound of her tires faded into the distance before walking over to retrieve it, smoothing the wrinkled paper in my hands. The language was legal and final. Clarissa had no claim, had never had a claim, and her attempt to sell the property would be seen not only as void, but potentially criminal. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it away. At that moment, I didn't feel vengeance or triumph. I felt something quieter, deeper, a kind of peace born from knowing the truth had finally been given its place. Clarissa had spent years trying to control the narrative, but my father had written the ending long before she ever held the pen. The house felt different after Clarissa left. Not simply quieter, but somehow lighter, as though the walls themselves had exhaled after years of holding their breath. I spent the next few days restoring what she had tried to erase, removing tasteless modern fixtures she had forced into spaces that once held warmth and memory. Each restored lamp, each repolished frame, was like setting a piece of my father's soul back into place. But even as I worked through the dust and disorder, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still waiting for me, unfinished, unsaid. It came, as it often does, in the form of something small, an unmarked envelope tucked inside a worn leather folder at the back of my father's study cabinet. The handwriting was unmistakable, his script, a little shakier than I remembered, but still his. The letter inside was dated just days before his passing, and as I unfolded the paper with trembling hands, I knew instinctively that this would not be an ordinary farewell. "My dearest Liv, if you're reading this, then things have unfolded exactly as I feared and hoped. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything in person. Clarissa was watching more closely than you realized, and I needed her to believe she had won. That was the only way this plan would hold. But there's more you need to know." As I read those first lines, tears welled in my eyes, not just from grief, but from the overwhelming clarity of how deeply my father had loved me, how much he had prepared behind closed doors to protect what mattered most. His words continued with startling honesty, revealing truths I had only begun to suspect during his final months. He wrote of the confusion that had crept in slowly, the dizziness, the memory slips, the weakness he had dismissed as age. But it hadn't been age. It had been deliberate, quiet, ongoing. I had James investigate when I started feeling off. It turns out the tea Clarissa insisted on preparing for me each night contained something, just enough to dull my senses, slow my thoughts. Not enough to raise alarms, but enough to make me doubt myself. I sat there stunned, the pages trembling in my hands as I absorbed the reality I had never dared to consider. She hadn't just wanted the house. She had been manipulating his very body, his mind, trying to weaken him into silence, into dependency. until she could legally move him aside without suspicion. "I played along, Liv," he wrote. "I let her think she was winning. But all the while I was recording, securing everything, so when the time came, you would have what you needed to finish what I started." My breath caught. I stood, numb, and crossed the room to the fireplace where he had told me once, years ago, that not all safes were made of metal. It didn't take long to find it. A loose brick, slightly discoloured, pried free with the edge of a screwdriver. Behind it, wrapped in aged cloth, was a small USB drive. And another note. "Show this to the authorities when you're ready. Let the truth speak for itself." I brought it upstairs, plugged it into my laptop, and what unfolded on the screen both horrified and validated everything I had quietly feared. Hidden camera footage showed Clarissa in the kitchen, adding drops from an unlabelled bottle into his tea. Another clip showed her on the phone with someone, speaking about what to do with the house once it's hers. There were files, recordings, financial statements, even blurry footage of her meeting a man at a cafe, someone I didn't recognise, but who was clearly more than just a friend. And there it was, my father's final defence. Evidence compiled not in anger but in love and determination. He had given me not just a house, not just legal documents, but proof of her betrayal, of his foresight, of his unspoken promise that even in silence, he had never stopped protecting me. I called James immediately. "I found the letter," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "and the drive." There was a pause, then his voice, calm and knowing. "Are you ready to use it?" I looked out the window, the garden below blooming with spring light, the roses standing tall against the breeze, and I thought about my father, not just the man who built shelves and fixed windows, but the man who played the long game, who stayed quiet not out of fear, but out of strategy. "Not yet," I said. "For now it's enough that we have it. The threat of truth is often more powerful than its release." James didn't argue. "Your father always said you were the only one who understood the importance of timing." He was right. The next morning, a large envelope arrived, slid beneath the front door with no knock and no explanation. Inside was a notarized document, signed and sealed. Clarissa's full relinquishment of any claim to the house or estate. Alongside it was a brief note, hastily scribbled in a hand that no longer carried confidence. "You win. I'm leaving the state. Keep what you know to yourself." She must have found the hidden cameras, perhaps searching the house for weeks after our confrontation, desperate to locate the source of her downfall. She had understood, finally, that exposure would cost her far more than a property. It would unravel the carefully constructed identity she had spent a lifetime curating. But she wasn't the story anymore. I stood in my father's study that afternoon, the sun cutting through the old windows, casting warm light across the desk he once sat at for hours. The drive was tucked back into its hiding place, not as a weapon, but as a shield, a silent guardian of a truth that had already served its purpose. In restoring the house, I had restored more than wood and paint. I had reclaimed peace not through vengeance but through patience. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of that home, I could feel him there with me, proud, watching, and finally at rest. In the weeks following Clarissa's departure, the house settled into a stillness that no longer felt heavy. It was as if her absence had lifted a veil from the walls, and what remained was the quiet kind of peace you can't force, only earn. I took my time reclaiming each room, not in haste or bitterness, but with deliberate care. Every photo I rehung, every rug I restored to its place, was a way of weaving memory back into the fabric of this home, not as a rebellion against what she had tried to erase, but as a declaration that love endures longer than pretense. One evening, while sorting through a stack of boxes in the attic, most of which had been sealed since the day of my father's funeral, I found a small wooden frame I hadn't seen in years. Inside, it was a photograph of the two of us standing in the garden, both of us covered in sawdust and paint, laughing without restraint, our hands resting on the freshly finished trellis that had taken us 3 weekends to build. I smiled at the sight of it, not with sadness, but with something softer. Gratitude, perhaps. Out in the garden, the heirloom roses were in full bloom, their petals wide and fragrant under the late spring sun. I had spent many mornings tending to them, clipping away dead growth, making room for new life, and in those moments, I often felt my father's presence more vividly than ever. It wasn't a voice or a vision. It was the way the air moved around me, the warmth of the sun against my back, and the sense that somewhere beyond what I could see, he was watching quietly, as he always had. The USB drive, still hidden behind the brick in the study, remained untouched. I hadn't needed to use it, and I hoped I never would. Its power lay not in exposure, but in possibility. Just knowing it existed was enough to keep the truth intact and the lies at bay. Clarissa had backed down not because she was defeated by scandal, but because she recognized, perhaps for the first time in her life, that some battles are lost long before the first move is made. What she had tried to take wasn't just a house, it was a legacy. But what she didn't understand was that legacies can't be stolen. They can only be inherited by those who honor them. My father's final lesson wasn't about revenge, it was about patience, about knowing when to speak and when to stay silent, when to fight and when to let the truth do the work on its own. And in the end, he was right. Strength doesn't always look like confrontation. Sometimes it's found in stillness, in knowing who you are when no one's watching, and in the quiet conviction that justice, though often delayed, will always arrive with its own weight and clarity. The house now stands exactly as he envisioned it, protected, preserved, and alive with memory. I don't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. Not to Clarissa, not to the neighbours who once believed her version of events, and not even to myself. My father believed in me long before I believed in myself, and that belief gave me the strength to stand my ground, not through fury, but through quiet resolve. And every time I pass by the study or kneel among the roses or sit by the fireplace he rebuilt with his own hands, I remember his words, the ones he left me not in letters, but in how he lived. The strongest roots grow in silence, hidden from view, until it's time to bloom. I've bloomed, and so has this home. If you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or quietly erased, know this. You are stronger than they think, and you are never alone in your story. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your voice deserves to be heard, and sometimes the quietest revenge is living well.